Hello, how are you? Great to see you today. I'm Dan Neely. I'm the CEO of Networked Insights, and I'm your host for day 2 of AdTech. I hope you're all well today. I hope you're all doing fine. How many of you in the audience have seen the movie Ender's Game? Not a single one of you. Oh no, there's a few of you. Sorry, you're slow to the uptake. So Ender's Game is a really interesting movie, right? So for those of you not familiar with it, it's about a child who believes that knowledge today will prevent future chaos. It's kind of an interesting analogy, right? This kid who's got massive knowledge becomes a great leader, a great strategist, and a great decision maker. It's very relevant for ad tech. Knowledge today in marketing becomes something that allows us to prevent future chaos in advertising. And so that's what I want to talk about today. That's what I want to spend a little bit of time on, and just for us to think about. So as marketers, those of you at home and those of you here, you're thinking about, how do I spend my money better than I have yesterday? How do I make my money perform better than I have? So today, this is not about Ender's Game. This is actually about Spender's Game. Right? I got a couple of chuckles. Thank you so much. So that's great. So when we think about Spender's Game, so what is the Spender's Game for marketers? The Spender's Game is about, how do I gain more knowledge? How do I have more things that inform the decisions that I'm about to make? Whether it be something in mobile, something in social, something in advertising as a whole, how do I use that? And ad tech is very much about this, right? Ad tech is very much about, how do I gain a set of knowledge today so I prevent future chaos in the future? And so whether that be in your role, whether that be in your company, whether that be with your customers, that's ultimately what we care about. So today we have a pretty packed schedule. We have a number of things going on. I'm super excited about a number of things that we're going to talk about. From a keynote standpoint, we have the first keynote I'm just jazzed about. It's about the future. And it's about how we can learn things today and how we can see trends that are happening and how we can use that in our businesses and in our lives. And the person that's going to come and talk to us about that is she's a phenomenal lady. So certainly I'm super excited about that. Our second keynote is something near and dear to my heart. It's about social advertising. And it's not going to be about social advertising, because we've got Facebook on stage, we've got Google on stage, we've got a number of others on stage that are going to talk about it. We're not going to talk about their businesses. We're going to talk about how social advertising breaks out of where it is today and how it becomes truly mainstream, and how we actually start affecting things within our businesses. And then our final keynote is about something that I know nothing about. It's about hair products. Kevin Jonas is going to join us. I'm just kidding. So in actual fact, what it is, so Kevin, right, it's about how celebrity and Hollywood intersect. It's also about how that intersects with marketing, and ultimately how those things come to life. So I'm pretty excited about what we're going to do today. I'm pretty excited about where we're going to go, where the journey might take us. I see some of you are looking at your phones. I don't think Twitter's actually gone public yet. So when that happens, I think, I'm sure you'll be looking at your phones, all of you making millions, I'm sure. Oh, look, another phone just came out. So with that, before we head into content, there's something that I'm pretty excited about. AdTech has a tradition of giving an Industry Achievement Award. And the Industry Achievement Award is something that is for people that generally have disrupted in their careers. They've gone into marketing and they're like, you know what, we need to do things differently. And so the person that's receiving this award is someone that was back in the late 90s. She was tapped for something by her executives to go and run a piece of marketing, which I think at the time was called marketing automation or something like that. It ultimately became digital marketing. And so she was tapped to do something to go and disrupt. Back in the 90s, think about 99, right? So I'm being asked to go and disrupt someone and go and disrupt something. And so she's been doing that for her career. And so I'm hugely excited by the fact that someone like this can win this award, and I'm excited by the fact that we can look to her and say, okay, how can we solve the things of today, right? She helped solve digital in its traditional form. She's now solving things in social. She's now solving things in marketing as a whole. So I'm going to welcome to the stage Anne Murray. She's the Senior Director of Marketing Communications at Southwest Airlines. I've got my award back here. Thanks so much. Right. There you go there.
Well, good morning. How's everybody doing today on this beautiful day in New York? Well, needless to say, I am honored and privileged to actually receive this award. As Dan said, late 90s, my boss at the time, the proverbial shoulder tap, hey, this internet thing looks like it might be taking off. We need somebody to start up the marketing practice inside of Southwest Airlines for what would eventually become a huge portion of our business. At the time, our business was we were sort of in the dark, if you will. We didn't know if the rest of the industry was actually transacting the way we were. So it was about 20% of our business was actually coming through online at the time. And under my fabulous journey during that time, getting to play in that space, we took it all the way up to its current number, which is at 87%. So unbelievable ride along the way. And in the industry, so think about late 90s, here I am inside of a Fortune 500 company being asked to basically go to a startup. Many of us can relate to that startup experience, but it was a really interesting ride, having the benefit of a big brand over you, but getting to do game-changing things inside that big brand. Well, I reached out to the community, and at that time, it didn't look like this. I mean, ad tech didn't even exist back then. And we were all of us that were sort of working in the back rooms of our, brands and the companies that were emerging to help us, there wasn't a community yet. So I was very fortunate to be part of one of the builders of that community and it didn't matter who we worked for. We were all trying to help each other figure this out. So with that, I'd like to say, may you always have the opportunity to have a risk and take that big leap into something that yet is not formed, and may you get to be a builder of the fabulous community that we see here today. Thank you very much.
Thanks. You good? All right, great. Let's give Sheryl another round of applause. Sorry, and another round of applause, sorry. So, our first keynote is coming up. Again, I'm super excited about this. So Sheryl Connelly is coming up. She has a cool job. She's a futurist. She looks at trends and she looks at how do those apply to the business of Ford. And so how does Ford look at these trends and think about where they're headed and where they're going? And so she leads that at Ford. The other thing that is really exciting about this person is why does she care about the future? So she has two daughters. And when you have two daughters, you care about what's going to happen next. You care about how this is going to impact your life and how this is going to impact those that come behind you. And so I am super excited to introduce Sheryl, and I'm really excited that she's going to give us a pretty dynamic talk today. So with that, let me introduce Sheryl Connelly from Ford.
Thank you.
Good luck.
So good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here and grateful that so many of you woke up early to come and hear what little old me had to say about the future. I'm Sheryl Connelly, and I am the Global Consumer Trends and Featuring Manager for Ford Motor Company. I want to start by just telling you a little bit about my journey of becoming a futurist. I have a twin sister. I am the fifth of 6 children, and my twin sister has been my lifelong advisor, my counselor. She's the person I turn to whenever I have a question or need advice. But her judgment came in the serious question, I don't know, about 12, 15 years ago when she told me she wanted to go see a fortune teller. And I said, oh my God, Shelley, that's a horrible idea. Don't do it, please. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. I don't think you should do it. And she said, oh my gosh, you're so overthinking it. It's just for fun. I don't really believe. And I'm not sure that I believe either. But deep down, I was scared. I was scared that what if the fortune teller told her something that she didn't want to hear? And that once they share that piece of news with you, there's no unringing the bell. And so we went to the tarot card reader, and we were having a great time. They're flipping the cards over. We were laughing. We were giggling until the death card appeared. And we're like, oh my God, it's the death card. And my sister, who had declared not to believe, to say it was all about fun and games, became completely unglued. She was certain it was a bad omen, a sign of things to come. And I spent the rest of the day, the rest of the week, the months that followed trying to convince her that it didn't mean anything, nothing bad would ever happen. And I'm pleased to tell you that she is alive and well, continues to thrive. But the reason I tell you that story is because what I remember most about that day is the sense that we had done something wrong, that we had brought this drama upon ourselves because we had tried to understand what the future held, that we had dared to try to predict or peek into the unknown. Fundamentally, I think many of us believe that the future is meant to be a mystery and therefore best left unexplored. But if you're in business, this just isn't practical. And so I like to refer to a quote from Henry Ford, who once said, if I'd asked consumers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So if you're in the type of business that I'm in, where we have a 3-year production cycle and an extraordinary capital investment, you have to try to understand what consumers are going to want. And it's not as simple as just going to them and saying, what can we do to make your life easier 3 years from now? I mean, if you would ask me, I would say, I don't know what's going to make my life easier 3 weeks, 3 days from now. But if you're going to dare to call yourself an innovator, then your job is to imagine a future that's otherwise unimaginable. Now, this sounds very kind of high ideals, but I would tell you that every single person in this audience is a futurist. And you probably just don't think about it in those terms. When you decided what to wear today, you were trying to predict the future. When you signed up or registered for this conference, if you got married, if you started a family, when you decided what college you would go to or where you would study, if you took out a car note, each and every time you do those things, you're trying to predict the future. Because you're basing your decisions on a set of assumptions on how you think the future will unfold. And that's really where my job comes in. Because obviously I can't predict the future. If I did, I would predict the winning lottery numbers week after week after week. What I do is I try to slow down the conversation. When you're doing long-term thinking, planning, or strategy, I say, well, what are the underlying assumptions built into your plan? And oftentimes they're so deeply ingrained, so subconscious to the way that we think, we struggle to even identify them. And once we do identify them, I just say, well, what happens if your assumptions turn out to be wrong? Is that still the plan you want to stick with? And so what I really do is just challenge people, ask a lot of what-if questions. And if you ask enough what-ifs, invariably you're going to run into some things that actually play out. There are lots of different tools that you can use to play the game of what-if in the arena of futuring. The one that we rely most heavily upon within Ford Motor Company is to track global trends. Now, we'll never be able to predict the future, but we do know that there are certain arenas that will shape the force of the marketplace. And that's social, technological, economic, environmental, and political arenas. Now, to be clear, what we consider a trend, many of you might consider a fad. So let me add a little definition to it. For the purposes of a company that has a 3 to 5 year time frame, we're looking for things that are slow moving, changes in deep-rooted values, attitudes, and behaviors. The only way I've figured out to explain this is to illustrate it by talking about blue jeans. Now, if you think about blue jeans, they've been around for a century and a half. In the early 1900s, they were often associated with a lower social economic status. They were the uniform of laborers because they were highly durable, very utilitarian, and relatively inexpensive. But today, denim is high fashion. People can wear it to the office, the finest restaurants. Some of my designer friends tell me they spend more money on their blue jeans than they do on their suits. And so that is a manifestation of a trend. It showcases that over the last 100 years, society's values, attitudes, and behaviors towards denim have changed. By contrast, if you think about styles of denim, high-rise, low-rise, skinny leg, boot-cut, colored denim, acid wash if you're from the 80s, these are fads. These are things that change from season to season. And if those are the things that we're following, that's our first cue that we're following the wrong things, because by the time we're ever able to act on them, we wouldn't be able to leverage them by the time the rubber hits the road, so to speak. The fad will have already passed. So what I'm going to take you through is a very audacious title of 10 trends that we believe are currently changing the world as we know it. So the first of which is population. Now, demographers would tell you that demographics is destiny, and that's why we start here, because the global population has 7 billion people in it. And that may not seem like a very remarkable number, but it should be, because the world has never known a population of that density. And during our lifetime, the number's going to grow. It's going to grow to 9 billion, 10 billion. Some people even say 11 billion by the year 2050, 4 short decades away. The primary question that should be on all of your minds is, can the planet support a population of that scale? We have no historical precedents to know for sure that it's possible. We know that we have limited resources. Can it actually feed a planet that has 9, 10, or 11 billion people? I take comfort in the words of E.O. Wilson, who's a Harvard-based biology, who says we have nothing to fear. There are 3.5 billion acres of land, and that's plenty to yield enough food to feed a population that could reach 11 billion people, but on one condition. Every single one of us would have to become a vegetarian. In other words, he says that we can feed 10.5 billion vegetarians or 2.5 billion carnivores. So when I started to wonder what that means for the future, I wondered, could we see wars, world wars, that are not fought over religion or land, but over things like beef, over what societies are willing to make the sacrifice for the greater good? Now here's a map that comes from the University of Michigan that kind of illustrates the point that I'm making, is that the population is growing, but it's going to happen in the parts of the world that are least capable of handling it. The top map is your standard landmass map. But the folks at University of Michigan went and expanded or contracted the landmass to reflect where the population was growing or shrinking. So by show of hands, do we have anyone from Canada in here? I'm sorry, if you can see, your homeland does not have a very promising future. But if you look to the Far East, you see that's where all of the growth is happening, and that's really the fundamental challenge, is that the growth is going to happen in the parts of the world that have widespread poverty. They have failing infrastructure and unstable or corrupt political systems. Now, the reason most of us don't notice this increase in population is because the advanced economies, the rich world, they're declining in fertility. That means that we're not having enough births to offset the deaths. In the 1970s, the average fertility rate per woman was about 5 children. Today it hovers around 2. So look around you and think about your own social circle, about serial singles, people who aren't married, or couples that have no children, or couples that have 1 child. They are not replenishing the population. As a byproduct of that, you get to our third trend, and that's the rapidly aging of the world's population. Every 7 seconds, another person turns 65 in the US. Globally, the population of 65 years and older will increase from 7% to 16%. Well, it doesn't sound very significant, but it's not evenly distributed. In some parts of the world, that number will be 35% of the population over 65 years of age. And this number is going to continue to get escalated because we're going to live longer. One scientist, Aubrey de Grey, has boldly declared that the first person to live to be 150 years of age has already been born. In other words, any single one of us in this room could live for a century and a half. And if not us, our children, our grandchildren. Now, this position is not universally held by scientists, but intuitively it should make sense to you, because that average global lifespan in the 1900s was somewhere around 40. Today it nears 80. And so it's likely to increase, and increase at a much more rapid pace with advances in technology. From automotive standpoint, one of the things we have to ask ourselves is, what does that mean in terms of mobility? If I'm 83 years old, I might be more than willing to surrender my car keys, thinking I'm going to live to be 85. But it's a completely different proposition if I think I'm going to live to be 105. What can we do to design or engineer a vehicle that ensures the freedom, the autonomy, and independence of owning and operating your own vehicle? Now, this aging population is a really big deal. In fact, the United Nations has declared it'll be the greatest challenge that we face in our lifetime, both from a social and economic standpoint. From a social standpoint, when you think about how upwardly mobile and globalized our workforce has become, we leave our families behind. So who will take care of the aged if no one from their immediate family is there to take care of their immediate needs? But from an economic standpoint, the heart of the issue is what's known as the dependency ratio. This is a metric that tells you how many workers you have supporting your non-working population. So by the year 2050 in Japan, their dependency ratio is going to be upside down. And what I mean by that is that they're going to have 108 retirees supported by 100 workers. Now, that statistic is based on a worker age between 15 and 60, and we're likely to change. But to illustrate that point, if you play out what that means for Japan, it means that their economic output will slow down. Their GDP will drop. Their famously high savings rate will start to erode. They'll have less money for investment and innovation. They'll lose their prominence and technological expertise, this political sphere of influence that they have, the social clout that they can wield. It's likely to migrate elsewhere. It's likely to migrate to an emerging market. Let's talk about China and India as possible places that it might move to. In 2002, Goldman Sachs coined the BRIC acronym. BRIC stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And they were answering the question of what are the markets that have the greatest potential for growth in the future. And it turns out that China and India are really the front runners. A lot of companies, Western-based companies, keep talking about what are we going to do to service these emerging markets. The mistake that many of us make, though, is that we think about them as a monolithic opportunity. But these two countries are dramatically different. China, for instance, is one of the most rapidly aging populations in the world. They've had decades of social engineering to control their population. In the 70s, they had something called late long few. It's where a government asked people to have children later in life, to wait longer periods between births, and to have fewer children. And in the 90s, they decided to make that a little bit more aggressive, and that's what became the one-child policy. So those children that are born under the one-child policy are born into what's known as the 4-2-1 dilemma. That means they will eventually be financially responsible for 2 parents and 4 aging grandparents. So their dependency ratio is something like 6-to-1. China is acutely aware of the problems that this aging population presents for them. In fact, they have a strategic mandate to find ways to grow rich before they grow old. And for that reason, many people think that they'll roll back the one-child policy. But for all the lip service that we give the one-child policy, it only affects about 35% of the urban of the population, because it only applies in urban areas. And it's become so cost intensive to raise children in China, and it's an extremely competitive environment, many people opt just to only have one child so they can funnel all of their resources towards their future success. One of the challenges China has is they're going to reach their peak worker productivity in the next couple of years. So we'll have to see how that plays out for them. Now, India is an exception to almost everything I just told you. They're one of the youngest populations in the world. When Japan's dependency ratio reaches 108 to 100 workers, India's dependency ratio will be 24 retirees to every 100 workers. This is known as a demographic dividend. It's the same sort of demographic dividend that brought China to its recent prominence on the global stage. But the political systems are fundamentally different. And ironically, it may be the democratic process that slows India in terms of leveraging this opportunity. China's communist command and control approach makes it very nimble and responsive to shifts in the marketplace, whereas India will have to take time to have a debate, build a consensus, hold a democratic process, their elections, and try to act on changes and opportunities come their way. And we know fundamentally there's great disparity between the have and have-nots throughout India. Fundamental rights in terms of safety and security continue to plague the country. Last December, there was widespread rioting after a young woman who had been gang raped eventually died. India will only be able to realize its potential if it can meaningfully employ and educate the masses. And if it can't provide basic fundamental safety and security, they have a long way to go. Both of these markets, though, are the places where we're going to see a lot of population growth, and it's going to change the way cities are formed. Worldwide, there are 20 megacities, and a megacity is a population of 10 million people or more. New York City, of course, is one of 2 megacities in the United States. The second is LA. And if any of you have had the misfortune of driving either of those cities, you know that driving in a megacity can be extremely challenging. Beijing, currently a megacity, they have today a 5-hour daily commute. And when they hosted the Summer Olympics some years ago, they had an infamous traffic jam that lasted 11 days long. So within Ford, we spend a lot of time worrying about this. Bill Ford, the chairman of our company and the great-grandson of Henry Ford, says that mobility is a critical component to the advancement of innovation and freedom. And in the future, if we see a population that grows to 9 billion people, it's reasonable to expect 4 billion vehicles on the road, but that'll serve nobody if they're all stuck in global gridlock. And if mobility is put in peril, do you thereby put the advancement of freedom and innovation in peril as well? So we're starting to explore lots of different multimodal forms of transportation, moving our eye towards how do we enable sustainable mobility for all. Another challenge that we'll face in the future is the global talent shortage. We're already seeing this today. We have a polarization of demand that is looking for extremely high-skilled workers and very low-skilled workers, and not much in between. In 2011, 26% of European employers said they were unable to fill jobs because they couldn't find an appropriate high skill set that they were looking for. That same year, Japan said they couldn't fill 80% of Japanese companies reported having troubles filling high-skilled jobs as well. In the coming decades, even in the US, we are going to have a shortage of 1.5 million college or graduate level skill workers against a backdrop of widespread unemployment, because we can expect to see some 6 million people that don't have high school diplomas or degrees. But maybe women will be a driving force in changing how that goes about. For many years, I've been talking about the rising power of women because women have advances in education, which are leading to better career opportunities and more financial independence. It's part of the reason we see so many women postponing marriage or having children altogether. For the first time in the United States, we have more single people than married people. But from an economic standpoint, the recession that we're still feeling the effects from, that started in 2008, some pundits refer to it as the man session or the he session. And what they mean by that is that the jobs that were lost came from industries dominated by men, construction and financial services. And as the economy recovers, the jobs that we see are coming from industries dominated by women, healthcare, and the service sectors. So we'll see lots of changes in the landscape of women, the roles that they play in terms of politics, industry, different ventures. In fact, one of my favorite quotes comes from an expert who has declared that by the year 2050, there'll be more female billionaires than male billionaires. But before I ruffle the feathers of the men in the room, you will still dominate in the millionaire ranks, and that's a much larger pool than the billionaire ranks. So the ninth trend that is changing is our reliance on information. We have a trend that we refer to as information addiction. And this probably doesn't need a lot of explanation. All of us know what that means. We're growing increasingly dependent on having information available at our fingertips, delivered in a just-in-time fashion. But I want to explore the reasons about why this trend is so powerful or what's driving it. The first of which is scrutiny. Mistrust in business, government, and media has never been higher. So on an individual consumer level, let the buyer beware has never been stronger. We feel compelled to do our due diligence, to scrutinize who and when we decide to do business. We also have a greater sense of time poverty, not enough hours in the day to do what we want to do. Now, this concept's not new. You can find journals that were written hundreds of years ago that basically say the same thing. I don't know where all the time goes, not enough hours in the day. But there is something tangibly different about time poverty in modern times, because we live in a world that's 24/7, 365 days a year. There is no downtime. The concept of banker hours has become obsolete. There's no forced day of rest. My favorite driver about information addiction, though, has to do with status. Since the recession in Western worlds, it's become very unfashionable to be conspicuous with your wealth. Nobody wants to be ostentatious with their displays of how they consume. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, during the era of excess, we used to look at opulent displays of wealth with admiration, with aspiration. But today we look at it with some scorn, with weariness, with suspicion. We as taxpayers wonder, did I have to bail them out of bankruptcy? Is that a homeowner who couldn't have overbought and couldn't afford the residence in which they lived? Did they work at a company that needed to be bailed out through government funds? So the new way that we showcase status is by being in the know, showcasing the information or access to information. Now, this isn't to be confused with having the highest IQ in the room. It just means that you're recognized as a go-to resource among your friends and family, your colleagues. Maybe it's because you know where the best sample sales are, or how to get into the newest, hottest restaurant in town. It could be as simple as having the most successful fantasy football team. But that sort of expertise is clout. The last driver about information addiction is probably the one that's most intriguing but least understood. There's an emerging field of science that basically says that there may be physiological reasons that cause us to seek out new information. Because the feel-good chemical that our brain releases when we receive a reward is the same chemical it releases when we seek out new information, when we come across new discoveries. At the very least, it helps explain how someone can lose themselves in the black hole of the internet for hours at a time, and I have absolutely no idea how they got there. A lot of these trends, though, have counter trends, and so information addiction's counter trend is information overload. So the paradox is that information has never been more readily available, but our ability to determine what's accurate, what's credible or reliable has never been more difficult. We get into a loop that's known as analysis paralysis. We research and we come up into polarizing points of view with no arbiter to help us determine what's actually relevant to us, what's critical. Barry Schwartz, who is a psychologist, actually talks about the paradox of choice and information analysis. From a consumer standpoint, nobody wants any restriction. We don't want limitation on our choices. But he's proven through empirical studies that sometimes when you give people too much choice, too much information, they tend to become so overwhelmed, so worried that they're going to make the wrong choice, they make no decision at all. He illustrated this by, don't quote me on the numbers, but he sold jelly and jam on a stand, and he sold four different flavors on the first day. On the next day he returned, and let's say he sold 40 different flavors of jellies and jams. One might think that his sales increased tenfold. I mean, 10 times the flavors means 10 times the likelihood that you're going to hit the flavor of your market's choice. But what he demonstrated was that sales actually dropped because people became overwhelmed by the abundance of choices, the flavors, the options that lay before them. I like to illustrate this by thinking about televisions. So if I were in the market for TV today, my choices would vary vastly. I could go with a plasma screen TV, a high definition, a 3D, maybe the new 4K TV that came out earlier this year at CES. But I know that if I wait, that the pace of innovation in this particular industry is so rapid that the prices of those goods are going to fall. They're going to fall rather dramatically. In fact, I believe that Sony is currently working for the holidays on a $3,000 version of the 4K television, significantly less than the $25,000 version that was shown at CES. Of course, it'll be smaller. But what if I wait even another year? Maybe it'll drop down to $1,000. In another year, it could be $500. But when I wait and wait and wait, when I'm ready to pull the trigger, maybe there'll be a 5K version or a 6K version or a 7K version that causes me to stay out of the market even longer. What if I do pull the trigger on that TV in the next month? Because choice as an innovation continues to move on, I never feel completely fulfilled or satisfied with what I have. In fact, Dr. Barry Schwartz actually attributes all of this abundance of choice as to higher instances of depression, less fulfillment with the things that we own. There's another dark side about being addicted to information or this information overload, and it comes from Sheryl, who is an MIT professor, and she wrote a book called Alone Together. And what's interesting about Sherry's story is that she was a pioneer, heralding the benefits of all the societal gifts that the World Wide Web and constant connectivity would provide us. But 2 decades later, she's done a complete turnaround. She actually worries. She worries that we use technology as a device to escape loneliness. So while you're attending this session today, you'll have lots of downtime, and I'm sure you're going to find yourself in a room where you look around, you go, I don't recognize anyone here, and many of us will turn to our phone for convenience or companionship, as an interesting text or email, a funny video to watch, as opposed to reaching out and engaging, trying to meet someone new, to actually have a face-to-face conversation. Sheryl says, what happens if we never get used to being alone? Then it means that we're likely to suffer more from loneliness as we age. The real concern, though, has a lot to do with innovation. She says, if we never get accustomed to being alone with our thoughts, the birthplace of insight and introspection, where innovation is born, what kind of future are we likely to see? So those are my 10 trends. And I know they probably made some of you very uneasy, but they shouldn't, because it's understanding and anticipating the future is the first step to trying to create the future that you want. If you heard things that you didn't like, now is the time to try to see if you can turn the tide. Because as it was once said, the future belongs to those who prepare for it today. So I hope that you'll take this opportunity to start thinking about the future and helping change what lies ahead. Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you.
That was really, really great. So we have some questions, so I thought if it's okay if we ask you some.
I'd love them.
All right, great. So when you first got the futurist title, how did you feel about that?
So I stumbled into my job. That's the question I get asked all the time.
Right.
Like, how do you become a futurist? I had no idea such a degree or position existed when I was young, and even after working at Ford Motor Company for 8 years, I thought it was going to be a temporary assignment. But when I found out what we did, I said, what do you mean all we do is read and we look at trends and we're not going to talk about cars, we're not going to talk about the industry? I thought it meant that I would lose my job almost immediately. It made me feel very vulnerable. I said, well, where does the value add come from? And it's interesting, it's exciting that the company does continue to support and embrace it and gives wide berth for time to learn and to soak up these different ideas that could change the way we see the world.
So if it's so important for companies to understand what's going on, how to ultimately plot those things out and how it's going to impact their businesses, whether it be financial impact, whether it be economic impact, geopolitical impact, why do more companies not have futurists?
Well, actually, I do see a number of kind of futurist organizations popping up, and there are 2 universities that teach actual programs or offer degrees in futuring. One is in Texas, and the other one is in Hawaii. And had I known that it was in Hawaii, I would have had a completely different career.
Well, Detroit versus Hawaii, I'm pretty sure
Sign me up. So you see more and more people that are calling themselves futurists. But I would say the work that I do exists in a lot of companies. They just may not label it the same way. So if you're thinking about product development or strategy or even communications, you're thinking about deep consumer insights and where they might go.
So there's a lot of people within companies like your own where they think about, I'm so busy that I've got to be thinking in the now. I've got to, the list is already too long and the things I've got to get done. How can someone that's in their role be thinking about, or how do they get some time to be thinking about this? How should they approach? They can't spend their time in the way you do, but they'd like at least to get a little bit of it so they can start thinking about it. So how would they approach that?
Well, I think fundamentally it comes with priorities in terms of what you see the most pressing priorities. In the early days of doing this work, I was given a task of socializing some things with our senior executive team. And it was in 2005, and I wanted to share with them some scenarios we had written about the year 2015. And at the time, automotive was on a slippery slope. Things were going very, very poorly. It was before we kind of bottom out. And I remember there were some executives that said, if you think I have the time to worry about 2015, then you don't understand how bad things are right now. There's actually a fair amount of contempt and disdain that I would deign to kind of say, well, maybe we should talk about 10 years from now. And while they have a point, I think every organization has to recognize that decisions that you make today, if you make them without an eye on towards the long-term future, you're setting your organization up for a future of constraints as opposed to a future of choice.
That's cool. So I specifically like number 8 on your list. I think it was about women.
Girl power.
Girl power. I think that should actually be number 1, not number 8, but we can talk about that another time. But one of the questions I have is, so in the role that you've had, and you've had it now for quite some time, how is information, the stream of information that you get, the types of information that you use, how has it changed? And how is it changing? Whether it be the type, whether it be the frequency, the recency, what things can you share as far as how that's changing, how that has changed since you've been in the role and through today, and then how you might see that changing in the future?
Sure. So I'm hoping that everyone in the audience gets my subtle message is that if I can be a futurist, you can be a futurist. I mean, it's not like a gift of foresight. It's really kind of a gift of time and where you decide to point your attention. When I joined the Trends team in the beginning of 2004, we bought a lot of syndicated studies. So there are organizations out there, they'll say, well, let me tell you what the trends are. But trends are very subjective, so as I said in the beginning, one person's trend will be another person's fad. If I worked in cell phone technology, I might be looking at something completely different because their innovation cycle is much more rapid than it is in automotive. But what happens is that it's really about pattern recognition. So in the beginning, what I looked at was a lot of syndicated studies, but over time, you start to kind of recognize patterns, and you'll say, I keep bumping into this or that, there's something there. The information addiction trend, I introduced it within Ford, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago. It was after reading an article called Information Lust, and I thought, We're a Ford Motor Company. We don't say lust. We don't say lust.
Kind of dangerous.
We don't say lust.
That.
We're a 100-year-old company. We're fairly conservative. I cannot go in and say lust. But I said, I think there's something here. And I started to kind of build upon that kernel of an idea. And one of my biggest delights is that within 2 years, the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, actually came out with a medical affliction called information addiction and talking about the breakdown in social interaction. So what you do is you come up with a point of view and then you look for evidence to say, was I on point or off point?
Wow, that's great. So the last question for you. So as you think about the future, what are you most excited about?
There are so many things, but I guess as a mother of 2 girls, I am really excited about how the opportunities that are being presented to girls worldwide. Today, there are more female entrepreneurs outside the G8 countries than male entrepreneurs. And the number of established micro-lending organizations have found that they have a much investments than male investments. But I also am careful to recognize that the changes that are happening for women couldn't happen without men also changing their perception. So the idea about unlimited choice, changing definitions, roles and responsibilities, I think is really exciting.
That's great. That's great. Thanks so much, Sheryl. It's been
Thank
really
you.
exciting. Thanks. Great. Thank you. Okay. So that is the end of this morning. You can all go and enjoy AdTech, go and venture through the floors, go and innovate, go and learn. Come back a little later today. We have another keynote around noon. We'll be back on stage talking about social media, social data, social advertising, and we'll have a panel from Facebook, Google, Hootsuite, and we'll spend some time having that discussion. So please go and enjoy.